Kate Mueller-Falcher, welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. I'm delighted to be back because it's time for our Saturday book, and I love this book. I think a lot of you did too. It's very entertaining, and I'm always reluctant to make these sorts of announcements because the universe has a funny way of teaching me the lessons in patience that I need to learn. Let me put it this way. The author of the book is going to come and speak with us after we finish covering it. And we're not very far into it. It's dense with information. Really entertaining. Oh, I should tell you the book. The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen. A panelist on TV's What's My Line and a fearless reporter, Ernest Hemingway called her the best female writer in the world. She scored the only exclusive interview with Jack Ruby and pursued the truth about the JFK assassination, but died trying, by a wonderful young author, Sara Jordan-Heintz, who I tracked her down, and she is going to come and talk about this book. This is quite a tour de force for a young writer. And I believe I've showed this before, but I'm going to show it to you again because it is simply mind-boggling. This is her selected bibliography. That means that she read other stuff that was maybe perhaps not quite as important, but contributed nevertheless. Look at all the pages of books she read and articles, research material. So okay, I've got to do the math here. 16, 19, almost 20 pages of books in her bibliography. Very, very impressive. So, maybe I should tell you, this is video number 3. For those of you who don't know, I do this because when I'm uploading these, I need to know what order to put them in. So, part 3 of Dorothy Kilgallen. And we were talking last about the arrival of 2 coffins at Bethesda. One, let's call it the show coffin, the fancy coffin with LBJ, Jackie, the Honor Guard, Air Force One. The other coffin, plain utilitarian coffin that was sort of secreted in the back door, so to speak. And now we will talk a little bit about the autopsy. So 2 naval doctors. Now, before we even start, let me say that in this book, anything that is claimed to have happened is backed with factual evidence, either primary source, documentation from different reports from the government, official forensic documents related to the case, and eyewitnesses, people who were really there. So these doctors spoke. It's really rather dramatic when you hear the testimony of these doctors. Most of this testimony, almost all of it, was done under oath. So 2 naval doctors did the autopsy. Neither was a forensic pathologist. So you might recognize some of these names as we move along. Milton Halpern, you should recognize that if you're into true crime. That's a name that pops up quite a bit. Chief Medical Examiner of New York City observed that selecting Commander Humes of the Naval medical field, to lead the autopsy was, quote, like sending a 7-year-old boy who has taken 3 lessons on the violin over to the New York Philharmonic and expecting him to perform a Tchaikovsky symphony. In other words, ill-prepared. The next name you might recognize, and I have to say, I think he recently died. I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I think he did. Famed forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht pointed out Humes and Boswell, the 2 naval doctors, quote, had never done a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. This is something that really needs to be emphasized to every American, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. This is your president. And you have multiple gunshot wounds to determine angle, trajectory, range, sequence, and then you have to correlate that with the multiple gunshot wounds of Connolly. This is a formidable task that would have required 2 or 3 major forensic pathologists to undertake. And yet, 2 completely ill-prepared doctors were given this job. Okay. They neglected to do, this says missed, but I think it's more that they just neglected to do a minimum of 20 routine forensic procedures that any forensic pathologist would automatically do at an autopsy of a suspicious death. November 26th, the 2 FBI agents that were assigned to stay with Kennedy's body at Bethesda wrote a report of a surgery to the head, meaning a tracheotomy that was performed, and they told the other agents, this information was told to these agents from the doctors, the other doctors, the 2 naval doctors who were doing the autopsy. These 2 autopsy doctors say to the FBI agents, his body's had surgery. There's been surgery to the head. There's been a tracheotomy. Who did that and when? These doctors were astute enough to recognize that they weren't receiving, I hate to use these terms, I don't know what else to call it, but like an undisturbed, a fresh body. They were receiving a body for autopsy that had already, according to their professional opinion, had surgical intervention. Who did that? There's no record of that. And they put it in their official report. Later reports from the autopsy were changed. They were altered. And questions have been posed over and over from eyewitnesses and through documentation. Why were descriptions of the wound that he had in his head so completely different? We're talking about huge gaping, back of the skull missing, exit wound versus, no, it wasn't. It was a shot from behind, tiny little wound. Just completely like a different scenario. Reports of the medical staff and Jackie's statement make no mention of the wound that was described being simple. The autopsy doctors describe this little wound, and they're talking about a wound 5 to 6 times larger. But as I said, there's these huge discrepancies. In 1996, there was a drawing by a doctor which showed the wound that was extensive from the back to the front, very obviously a shot from the front that did enormous damage to the back of his head. Just lots of documentary evidence documenting, papers documenting. This all sort of leads people to ask the question, this might indicate a post-mortem surgery. In other words, something was done to alter the wounds after he had died. And if that is indeed true, which it sounds like from medical eyewitnesses and a lot of other eyewitnesses that it did happen, this would be obstruction of justice and a criminal conspiracy. Autopsy doctors also noted a 3-inch crescent-shaped flap on the right side, front side of Kennedy's head in the temple region. A neurologist with over 30 years of experience in private practice and academics who has viewed and extensively studied the autopsy x-rays and photographs from the National Archive said, quote, "All of this that you're seeing here was not seen at Parkland. This it's like a different person, and not implying it's a different person. It's an altered wound, but it's like they're talking about a different person because it's so different. The original doctors, when he was brought into the emergency room, got an unadulterated look at what was going on with this man, what kind of injuries he's had. They were altered later. This is what this is saying, allegedly. All of this that you're seeing here was not seen at Parkland. This is a quote. This incision was not present at Parkland. We've witnesses who attest to that. It's my opinion that this deep incision was done to somehow manipulate the evidence in this area. There was no reason to do a V incision like this as part of an autopsy. It's just not done. You do an incision across from ear to ear to move the scalp back to access the brain. Sorry. So it wasn't there at Parkland. It was there by the time the official autopsy began at Bethesda. What? Think about that a minute. So all the doctors who dealt with him when he came in immediately after the shooting describe one set of injuries. A couple hours later, his body arrives, and the naval forensic, well, they're not real forensic autopsy doctors. They're just two doctors assigned to do the autopsy. They're describing a completely different set of injuries. Okay, so I won't go into that anymore. So there was a small entry wound in his right temple that had been hidden by his hair, but it could be seen in x-ray. So I think what they're implying is front entry wound, back exit wound. The throat wound was altered by a bogus tracheotomy incision, and surgeons and pathologists who've looked at this said they would never make such a large incision to do a tracheotomy, that it was a butcher job. And the doctor who did it obviously was trying to interfere with the track of the bullet that went in there. After the trachea was removed, the incision was closed. After, usually when you remove a tracheal tube, the incision sort of closes in on itself, and you'd still be able to see the bullet wound that was there. So they're not implying, they're saying that somebody saw this bullet wound and said, okay, we have to change that. And so to interfere with the forensics of the bullet wound, you won't be able to tell the trajectory, and you won't be able to tell exit entry. They just created this bizarre, enormous tracheotomy hole incision that would never have been done in the way that it was done in normal tracheotomy. So there's a lot of doctors that are saying, what is going on here? The Bethesda, so like officials at Bethesda, threatened the doctors at Parkland with removing their medical licenses unless they went along with the throat wound here being an exit wound. And it was a lie. And the doctors at Parkland, they had a choice. They could tell the truth and end up dead like a whole lot of other witnesses. And they actually say that later. It's going to be interesting. You stick around. Dr. Perry, who, or perhaps it's Percy, I can't read my handwriting, a Parkland surgeon, gave the Warren Commission this information. He said it could be an exit or an entry wound. That's what he said to the Warren Commission. But he actually told friends in private that wound was an entry wound. Absolutely no doubt in my mind. Dr. Livingston of the National Institutes of Health agreed. He talked on the phone with Dr. Hume, one of the Bethesda pathologists, and they had to make a case for all the wounds being from behind, so they could say there was one shooter from the book depository. So they weren't above physically changing what the wounds looked like and giving descriptions that were not true in order to conform to the necessary story of the one shooter. Dr. Hume said, the FBI won't let me talk anymore. Goodbye, and hung up the phone. this back wound that they marked on a chart and the holes in his clothing agree with each other. And that evidence shows that the wound itself was much lower than the throat wound, and it could not possibly have come from multiple stories above. The trajectory just didn't. They found a bullet on the limo floor. They found pieces of skull and a spent bullet, but it disappeared. I mean, it was documented that they found it. Eyewitness FBI people and medical people talked about it, but then it disappeared and it never was placed in evidence. There were discrepancies in the autopsy beyond the weird tracheotomy thing. His brain weight, they think, was falsified. They gave a weight that was larger than average, but I'm sorry, this is so gross. Half his brain was missing. So what? What did they give it more than the normal brain weight, but he has less than half of the normal brain. That's just weird. Why did two pathologists stay for several hours after the post-mortem to assist the mortician? This truly happened. This was documented. So these guys who were not forensic pathologists did this bizarre autopsy that skipped all sort, like over 20 important tests, procedures that would have been done in a normal forensic autopsy, described things that were not anything at all like the original doctors had seen, and then hung around to help the mortician. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. My husband worked in a medical lab. Never does the pathologist engage with the mortician. It's not a thing. So the question is, what were they altering? What were they reconstructing? What were they doing? There were photographs that were taken at this time of his injuries, and they support the conventional story. And what the book is getting at, and what a lot of people, researchers, get at here, is that the evidence was manipulated for photographic evidence, that something weird was done to make it look like the injury was different than it really was. And 18 of those pictures are missing completely. One FBI agent saw Kennedy in the trauma room, and in his deposition, he said that these photos that you're showing me now, those have been doctored, because that's not what I saw in the emergency room. Robert Kennedy, when he finally got to see Kennedy's body, he fainted. They decided to copy Lincoln's funeral to make a point. They had more than 250,000 people who filed past Kennedy's coffin in the Capitol Rotunda, and it is very disturbing to me. I remember this vividly. I was a child. My parents were traumatized. I remember this like it happened yesterday. And it's really disturbing. I've been to the Capitol building. I've stood in the rotunda and looked up at the artwork, the glass, the dome, everything. It's really disturbing to talk about this in the context of post-January 6th. It's not in the book. I'm putting that out there. 1 million people lined the streets from, I guess, the church to his grave. Dorothy Kilgallen wrote 2 columns after the assassination. The first one was about her son's visit, she and her son's visit to Kennedy in his office. The second was about the courage that Jackie showed under, it's easy to forget because she's this sort of larger-than-life person, kind of an iconic person. She was young. She was in her early 30s. She just had a miscarriage, or was it a stillbirth? I can't remember now. She had had some real traumatic things happen to her within a short period of time. culminating in this god-awful nightmare. Jackie never went along with the official story. She always called out all of the lies that were told about Dallas. And I won't even say allegedly, because research and later congressional hearings have pretty much been in agreement that there's something hinky about the whole thing. Jackie always called out the lies, and she went out of her way to the best of her ability to let it be known. Immediately after the shooting, just no investigation, same day situation, Oswald was called guilty in the press. There was no due process. It was just, I remember that too. I mean, there was no question that he did it alone, he was the guilty one, lone wolf, that kind of thing. And all along, he emphatically denied that he didn't do it. I remember that. I remember him being stopped in the hallway. They kept parading him in and out of offices, up and down hallways, all these guys in cowboy hats, I think it was photo ops, basically. And he had been hit. He had a swollen eye. And he was shocked. You could just tell this is somebody who had no idea what was going on. And he was asked by one of the press members, why did you shoot the president? And he said, I'm paraphrasing, he said something to the effect of, I didn't shoot anybody. I'm a patsy. He made that quite clear. A big Texas wink at the concept of justice was seen in a sign that was hidden in District Attorney Henry Wade's office, which said, any prosecutor can convict a guilty man. It takes a great prosecutor to convict an innocent man. Wow. The CIA painted a picture to the public. They gave an impression of Oswald. They manipulated what they wanted us to think. That he was a crazy loner, or a commie lover, we'd rather be in Russia, he married a Russian, he hated America, that kind of thing. J. Edgar Hoover disagreed. Now this is interesting. J. Edgar Hoover disagreed. He believed that Oswald had been impersonated at the Soviet embassy in Mexico. There was this whole elaborate story about him passing state secrets. He'd cross the border, go to Mexico City, go to the Russian embassy in Mexico City. Maybe it was the Cuban embassy, I can't remember. And pass on state secrets. Oh, it's the Russian embassy. And he denied this vehemently. He didn't have very long to deny anything. He was dead the next day, but he denied this vehemently. And Hoover actually had warned previously, which we'll talk about here in a second, but Hoover later, after Oswald's death, he would not go along with the official story. He said that wasn't Oswald. That was an Oswald impersonator. They were already setting up a narrative. It was a very, very sophisticated, long planning narrative for what they did. And Oswald always said he never went to Mexico. I've never been to Mexico. I don't know what you're talking about. Hoover warned of Oswald's impersonator even existing in 1960, while Oswald was in Russia. And, the question has been raised, was this an elaborate ruse in an effort to frame him? They set him up. He said he was a patsy. J. Edgar Hoover said he was set up. He denied that he was in Mexico City. The NSA said that the CIA was spinning a web of deception. American intelligence agencies were at each other's throats over this. Now the CIA says Director McCone of the CIA did withhold information from the Warren Commission. In 2013, they admitted that he was complicit in keeping incendiary information from the Warren Commission. The CIA had been in communication with Oswald before 1963. So this story is kind of unfolding this picture of a hapless, kind of useful idiot who had his issues, had his problems, and kind of played right into their hands. They saw a patsy coming a mile off, and they needed somebody that they could blame. Somebody who was so suspect that people would assume bad things about him. And boy, I'll tell you, Dallas was the place to do it when you hear more about Dallas. Dallas Police Captain Fritz, the head of the city police, got a call from LBJ. And the conversation went like this. You have your man. He was told by LBJ, you have your man. It was announced that Oswald killed Kennedy. This went to press less than 24 hours after he was arrested. Now, keep in mind, they're not even done interrogating him yet, but they've decided this is how it went down. Hoover said that the evidence pointed to Oswald's innocence. So you got the FBI and the CIA on the opposite sides of this story. There's reason to believe that LBJ was complicit in a palace coup. This is the book's words, not my words. It was claimed that there was fear that the U.S. leadership was the target of foreign communist assassins, according to LBJ. But he didn't act like that because he was the vice president, right? He would be on that list of targets. He didn't act like that. The DA, Wade, held that Marina Oswald told Wade in Dallas that Lee Harvey Oswald had a gun. She denied this later. So, police chief is in cahoots with LBJ. The district attorney is making claims, what Oswald's wife said. Oswald's denying everything. His wife is denying everything. And I think it's important to keep in mind that his wife was really young. She was a victim of domestic abuse. She didn't speak English at all, barely. She had a just under 2-month-old baby and a toddler. And she was living with her mother-in-law. It's not a good scenario at all. So she was immediately sequestered by the FBI and the Secret Service so that they could release any story they wanted to without her denials in real time. After many years, she was finally able to speak. She finally learned enough English, had enough agency, time had gone by, she felt less threatened, and she denied all of this stuff. She denied the whole scenario. The ACLU said that Oswald's trial would have been reversed if he'd lived long enough to have a trial, but it would have been reversed because of the conflict of pretrial publicity. The ACLU is basically saying this whole thing stank to high heaven from the very beginning, and there was apparent intention to muddy the waters. Let's just put all kinds of misinformation out there. Let's taint the jury pool. Let's manipulate the feelings of the public. Let's shine doubt on everything. Pretty sophisticated. The ACLU also objected to the way Oswald was treated in custody. So what's behind some of this? So here are some speculations. Some of this is fact, and some of this is connecting things based on the facts. So Big Oil, Texas, Big Oil wanted to keep oil depletion because they wanted it to be inflated in cost. Kennedy wanted to end oil depletion. So my very inadequate understanding of this is they had the oil, but they withheld either what they were putting into barrels, what they were pulling out of the ground, they had access to it, or it was in barrels and they were withholding it from the market. But the end result being the same. Not enough oil, the cost is higher. They get richer. Kennedy didn't, he wasn't having that. Big Oil, and we're talking, they list, a number of names of oil executives, and there's just so much information that you have to read the book. I skipped the names. So these guys, these rich billionaire oil guys, owned the book depository. I'm just saying. So let me look at this because I wrote these notes really quickly. The director of Dorchester Gas, a guy called Crichton, who was in former military intelligence. He was a close friend of George H.W. Bush, who was secret CIA operative before he became the head of it. So this guy, the director of this gas company, was in charge of the arrangements for Kennedy's visit to Dallas. It's like the fox guarding the chicken house, right? His close friend was the deputy police chief of Dallas, and this guy, in cahoots with Big Oil, in cahoots with former CIA operatives, drove the first car in the motorcade. This case is so complicated. You see why they'll never be able to untangle this Gordian knot. But these little threads we pull just astound. So the guy in the first car, who drove the first car, was best friends with the deputy police chief of Dallas, who was in cahoots with Johnson, LBJ, and the whole set of arrangements was made by the head of the gas companies, one of the guys who wanted Kennedy out, and he and his pals owned the book depository. H.L. Hunt was on the oil company board. He helped with the first interrogation of Marina. They had a Russian translator from the Dallas police. I bet that was an interesting accent. And this guy Crichton, the former military intelligence guy. This poor young woman, I don't know what her background was, how into this whole thing she was, how aware she was, but I just think it would have been really intimidating. Her words, which we don't even know what they were, but it was said that her words implicated Oswald, according to the translator, but later transcripts described that the translations were not literal translations of her Russian words. So they had a plant, who was a translator, ostensibly translating her Russian into English, but no, it's not what happened. She later learned English, and she was aghast at how they had changed her words in the transcripts. She was horrified. Basically, she said, I never said that. I never said that. They're changing my words. She was put under protection, but the FBI and the Secret Service fought over who was going to be in charge of her. Now, why was this? We don't have an answer for that, but it's an interesting question. How did Hunt, who was a private citizen on the board of an oil company, how did he get involved in a police interrogation having to do with the assassination of a president? What? How did that happen? H.L. Hunt. Now, this is not to be confused with Howard Hunt from Watergate fame. This is H.L. Hunt, a big oil guy. He was the richest man in the world at the time. He was a right-wing extremist. He was a segregationist. He believed rich people should have bigger voting rights than poor people. Oh, if he were alive today, he'd be MAGA. He was close friends with J. Edgar Hoover. Why was he sitting? His only qualifications was he was rich. He had 2 secret families besides his official family in Dallas. He named his house, he had like big fancy estate called Mount Vernon, but it was actually 5 times bigger than the original Mount Vernon of George Washington. He made it quite clear that he did not want Oswald to live long enough to go to trial, and he really feared a real investigation. That should be red flags for all of us. He was the one in charge of security for Oswald. He was nervous. This is known about him. He was fearful that his connections with the mafia would become public. There was no security around the jail. And as I said, Oswald was paraded up and down the halls for the press. 15 times. I wasn't just exaggerating. 15 times. They would just take him out of an office and walk him down the hall. And I remember watching this live on television. It was unusual in those days to have constant, uninterrupted live coverage, but they just had press in the hallway of the police department, and these cops had pushed their way by, and there was no guard around him or anything. It was just anyway. And the question is, were they doing it on purpose, kind of like fishing, trolling for somebody to get Oswald? So Jack Ruby, now the story is nobody knew him, and here's the real story. Ruby was allowed in to bring sandwiches to the police, allowed into the police station. This is I think Friday or very early Saturday, but he was bringing lunch to the cops, and it seemed like he was remarkably familiar with them, but he was also really familiar with Fair Play for Cuba. This is the group Oswald belonged to, who he was seen passing out leaflets in support of Fair Play for Cuba. Dorothy Kilgallen wrote about Oswald's mysterious life. He never got fined for passing out those pamphlets, which should have been illegal they were illegal in Louisiana. He should have been fined, but he wasn't. When he was in, I believe this was New Orleans, passing out leaflets for Fair Play for Cuba, which was against the law in Louisiana, it was timed perfectly that the district attorney was out of town. Jim Garrison was out of town. Hoover was worried about Oswald's transfer from the Dallas police station to wherever they were taking him. I don't remember, probably an upgrade prison or whatever. He even called Parkland Hospital emergency room and told them to be on standby in case there was a problem. When Hunt, the oil guy, heard about the lax security, he called in his mafia pals for help, which that's curious. Hunt's attorney and right-hand man later testified as early as 1960, Hunt wanted what he called a removal group. So right around the time of Kennedy being inaugurated, this rich oil guy, Hunt, had been trying to organize what he called a removal group. 2 + 2 equals trying to put together an assassination team. And his best friend, right-hand man, testified under oath to this. So this is the source for this. They actually planned 4 completely independent groups that did not even know about each other. No contact between them. They were essentially kill squads. And his mafia friend that he called recommended to him, put the idea in his head that the assassin of the assassin should also die. So let's continue. It's a really mind-boggling story here. There were approximately 32 people on Dealey Plaza who made movies, took photos, had cameras, and their equipment and their film was confiscated. Who confiscated them? Well, you ask a very good question, because officials deny they did this. They weren't sure, these people, who was taking their cameras away from them. Some of them were told FBI, some of them were told Secret Service, guys in suits. And it happened immediately. It happened for a lot of them while they were outside, crouching down, trying to hide. And they reported, this later, and the agencies that they claimed did it all denied it. No, we didn't take it. Cops didn't take it. FBI didn't take it. Secret Service didn't take it. So the CBS affiliate had footage, and it was destroyed during processing. Oh, whoops. The government got their hands on the Zapruder film for a price, which would have been about $1.5 million equivalent today at the time. Oh, wait, maybe I misread that. Maybe it was $1.5 million at the time, and by 1999, with interest, it would have been worth $16 million. The government justified taking this film by telling them that it was classified as property of the people of the United States. Should they have given anybody money for this? Should they have given money? But they're essentially buying evidence in a criminal case. So it's another little sideline issue that's problematic. There's now what's called the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas. And it got the copyright and licensing fees. They got all of the ownership of stills that were available of the assassination. But the argument is, well, okay, this happened. This is not debatable. They got their hands on this stuff. They paid for it because it was evidence. You don't pay for evidence. But then they let the museum get copyright on all these pictures. Didn't taxpayer money pay for it? What's going on here? There's this weird situation going on here. Keep in mind, this is the Sixth Floor Museum of the building that the oil executives own, the oil companies own. Some people say that this money, I don't know, some people say this, I don't know if this is true, but they say that ostensibly this money was the equivalent of hush money, because they took this film from Zapruder and they altered it. To shut him up, they gave him money. Nevertheless, it was in the hands of the CIA by the very next day, by the 23rd. A photo expert who handled the films and was very experienced said that Kennedy was hit 6 times from 3 different angles. So this is the original photo developer guy before anybody got to him, before official photo developers got involved. This guy always maintained, hey, I saw the original film. He was shot 6 times from 3 different locations. So there's all kinds of controversy about this film having been altered, and 2 different versions do exist to our knowledge. The film was altered. There was a developing crew that was paid by the CIA, and they gave testimony in 1997. The 2 crews who developed the film didn't know about each other, so the film was originally developed by 2 different crews. Both thought they had the only original. The head of one lab later testified that Kennedy was shot 6 to 8 times from at least 3 directions. But frames supporting only 3 shots, all from behind, were spliced in to this altered version of the film. The lab personnel who saw the original film were shocked at the altered version that was shown to the public. They were like, hey, wait a minute, you're showing this thing on TV. This is not what we developed. The original film agreed with the eyewitness testimony and not with the official one-shooter from the back version. Today, thanks to computers, high-tech experts identify this film. On this film, they said that the head wound was faked to look smaller and different, actually on the film. So when it was happening, even that it's really gross, and I won't go into detail. There's detail in the book, and it's really gross. But the bullet hits him, and And even as awful as it looked, because it really looked bad, it was way worse, and it describes debris on people standing around and cops and Secret Service people. I mean, it was bad. Doctors agree with this, that the film doesn't show an accurate portrayal of what really happened. It had to have been doctored. The original film was made in a really good camera. It cost Zapruder a lot. It was a rare camera. And the original film was really clear. That's not what we saw. Hollywood film restorers have had a chance to look at it, and they agree that it was very crudely altered. Life magazine bought all the rights to it, and the publisher had a close ties to the CIA, and it managed to keep this film out of the public eye, away from public scrutiny for a long time. And then the magazine repeatedly reported whatever story the powers that be wanted them to repeat. Time magazine called anyone who criticized these lies, these stories, communists. So Saturday morning, this is the day after the assassination, we've got Oswald in the grip of this allegedly corrupt Dallas Police Department. Inspector Kelly of the Secret Service told Oswald that he would be glad to sit down and hear his story. And Oswald said, okay, I want to talk to you. I want a lawyer. And so then he was escorted out of the jail, and we know what happened. There was no security in the front, on the orders of the Dallas Police Department Chief Fritz. So he cleared the path. Fritz was in the front, and he hurried forward. Oh, and he literally cleared a path in front of Oswald. There was a large gap that exposed him to this mob of people. Lots of looky-loos in the hallway. And it's on film. You can look back on this. There 2 horns beeped. It was very weird. It was like a signal. 2 horns beeped, and Ruby sprinted forward and shot Oswald. Eyewitnesses, I can't read my handwriting, it doesn't matter. Well, basically, the police chief made himself scarce, opened a wide range where Oswald was completely vulnerable to view. Ruby, who shouldn't have been there, nobody knows why they let him in. He had nothing to do with nothing, but here he was. And he has free access to Oswald. J. Edgar Hoover called it inexcusable. The Dallas Police Department failed, and the question that a lot of people are still asking was this on purpose? The cop that was cuffed to Oswald was mad that when he came out with Oswald cuffed to him, they were supposed to get into a car. The car wasn't where it was supposed to be. Had the car been in the place it was supposed to have been, Ruby wouldn't have had a clear shot. So Fritz is the one who arranged the car and the timing and the lack of security, and so that begs the question, how complicit was he? When the cops came out of wherever they were holding Oswald and they started out, they were shocked by the proximity of the press and this crowd, this mob. Nixon saw this on TV. And what does Nixon say? Nixon recognized Ruby as LBJ's man from the 1940s. Ruby had been a paid informant for LBJ. This is according to the testimony or the words of Richard Nixon. So, take it with a block of salt. But no, I think it's interesting. LBJ, Ruby, and Hunt, the oil guy, so the president, the assassin of the assassin, a low-life, 2-bit petty criminal, and an oil billionaire guy were seen together a few months before the assassination. During the Parkland reconstruction, so they brought everybody back. Taxi drivers, random people walking by, all the medical students and nurses, anybody who was a patient in the emergency room, every single person that they could possibly get back in, and took their places where they had been the day of the assassination. They wanted to reconstruct what happened. And Johnson called a doctor away, and they discovered this, that Johnson, there was a phone call. It's the president wants to talk to this doctor who's trying to resuscitate a dead guy, because Kennedy was dead before they ever sped the car up. He was dead. But they had to go through, I guess, some appearance of trying. And the doctor later said, if I'd seen the head wound in the back first, I would have done nothing. But, yeah. Anyway, LBJ called this doctor away from his efforts to resuscitate the president. And, away from, what's his name, Oswald, and tried to get a deathbed confession. So they're doing this reconstruction, and in comes Oswald on a stretcher. He's been shot, not dead yet, and he was going to have surgery. And LBJ demanded that they get a deathbed confession from him. Meanwhile, there's this chaos going around again. Hoover admitted that the FBI agents were dressed in scrubs, and they were there to take the confession. So there's just weirdness going on. There were also Secret Service agents in the hospital, too, when Oswald was brought in. The doctor didn't talk about this. Nobody knew that he took a call from LBJ for 29 years because he was afraid of LBJ and he was afraid of LBJ's associates. He admitted that later. The hospital operator confirmed, LBJ called the hospital that day. Dallas authorities announced that 100% Oswald was the killer, so we're good to go because now he's dead. There was much international criticism of the whole Kennedy thing, and already people on an international level were saying, well, obviously this was an elaborate conspiracy. Obviously. Dan Rather, this is funny, Dan Rather had been transferred to New Orleans to be a reporter. This is the home of mafiosi. And he was assigned to deal with the reporting on the Zapruder film. Rather just happened to be 90 feet from the grassy knoll when the shooting happened. Just coincidence. Rather, on television, described things that did not happen, including movements of Kennedy's head. So Rather sort of narrated the Zapruder film when it was finally shown, and he would say things like, I'm making this up, but just to give you an example, he would say things like, and here we see the president's head move forward, and it would move backward. So, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? In 1975, Geraldo Rivera got a pirated version of the film, and it showed Kennedy react to a shot from the front. Eyewitnesses claimed that it came from a wooden fence and a bunch of trees, that they saw smoke, gun smoke, rising from behind this fence inside the trees, up beyond the grass. And interestingly, when you watch the film of that moment, all these eyewitnesses, police, officials, and ordinary citizens all start running to that spot. Jackie testified that that's where she thought it came from as well. Rather was rewarded with his CBS White House career after misnarrating the Zapruder film. and later did somersaults in defense of the Warren report. When Oswald was killed, Dorothy Kilgallen became a vocal critic of the official account. Remember, she was an investigative journalist. She was an astute crime reporter. She had a ton of experience, and it'd be very difficult to pull the wool over her eyes. She called on LBJ to satisfy the public's uneasy mind in her column. So these are her words. I want to make that clear for the sake of YouTube. To quote Dorothy Kilgallen in her column, people feel that they've witnessed a lynching at Oswald's death. In other words, he was executed, and it was pretty apparent to anybody who was really paying attention. And Dorothy Kilgallen called out LBJ on this by name. How could Dallas police let Ruby stroll in like this? It just boggles the mind. Where was the security? Cops knew Ruby, so that in itself is interesting. They knew he carried a gun. The cops were carding journalists and reporters and cameramen, but nobody stopped Ruby. I guess, he's our old pal with the gun, Jack Ruby. And one of the cops said, we plumb forgot to ask him for his gun at the door. It's just unbelievable. And what this did, aside from the fact that a young man was killed, what it did was it prevented due process. We will never know. So, in the understatement of the century, and I'm not sure if Dorothy Kilgallen said this or if the author said this, but it bears repeating, as I said, understatement. There's something strange about this case. So we have the right to know, and it can't be kept locked in a file in Dallas. It has to be made public. Dorothy Kilgallen was the lone press voice for a very long time, calling the whole thing a cover-up. Initial TV reports were about a right front shot, one shot, and then a right front shot through the throat. So he was shot a couple of times from the front and once from the back. One shot went through his throat. Now I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, that would be wrong, went through his throat. The other one was on his temple. I don't know if it was his right or his left temple, but that's what caused the exit wound in the back. And then he was shot in the back too. NBC was warned by the FBI that any information they put out better agree with the Bureau's official story. But after 3 on the afternoon of the 22nd, the doctors at Parkland talked to the press in a press conference about a shot from the front. So the original reporting from the Dallas local station, from the doctors at the press conference, all said from the front. The neck wound was from the front. The head wound was an exit wound. Dallas Secret Service agent Moore threatened a doctor after the press conference and said, "Don't you ever say that again." The doctor said he was shot from the front, and the Secret Service guy got him up against a wall and threatened him. This agent also badgered other doctors. He called JFK a pinko. They agitated hatred for JFK. The Secret Service agent who was harassing the doctors, he got a promotion. He became aide-de-camp for Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren of, wait for it, the Warren Commission. It was claimed later that he acted on orders from Washington, D.C., specifically from Tom Kelly. And the doctors were coerced to say that Kennedy was shot from behind, but that was not their original judgment of what happened. Conflicting reports shine suspicion on autopsy doctors. The throat wound from the front became a neck wound. You just change one word and boy, your whole visual changes too. In private, Dr. Perry, it wasn't Percy, it was Perry. Dr. Perry insisted that it was a front entry wound. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. And I think this is a good spot to end video number 3. And I'll be back in a minute with video number 4. And I hope you're enjoying this. Now, there's a lot of information in here. There are contradictory stories. There are questionable sources. There are reliable sources. There are people that are just in complete disagreement. Supporting evidence for a lot of things, manipulated evidence for other things. It's a mess, and that's why it's never been definitively solved. Dorothy Kilgallen was working on it. We're going to get back to her life, but I didn't realize when I started the book that it would dig so deeply into the Kennedy assassination. But of course it would. I don't know what I was thinking. So fascinating. It's a little diversion from her story of her life, but we need to know the information she was gathering. This is all stuff she was investigating, and these are the reasons why she was raising questions and challenging the official story, which is incredibly brave. A lot of the doctors wouldn't talk. 29 years, 30 years, I'm not talking about this. So, okay, thanks for watching, and I'll be back. Slung with oil.